Now let's talk about if the government needs to be responsive to what people believe. How do we know what people believe? Well, the primary means of doing this, and it's not perfect by any stretch, is the public opinion poll. Now, public opinion polls are just that. You go around and you ask people what they think. But they're not all the same, and they're not all equally valid. And, of course, there's not one public opinion. In politics, if 56% of the people feel one way, that's like a landslide, and you're thinking, but wait a minute, but 44% of the people feel the other way. Yeah, well, we're divided on a lot of issues, and once you see polls getting into the 70s and 80s, that basically is consensus. Not to diminish the opinions of the people who disagree, but the reality is that you can poll almost anything, and some people will say the opposite of what you expect to hear. Polls are valid depending on a few things. One, their sample. The idea of a poll is that you choose a representative sample that then you can then extrapolate to a much larger number. Now, the sample has to be random. If the sample inherently favors one group or another, it's invalid. This is why, for example, polls that you see online where people choose to take it or not take it aren't considered legitimate polls because it's not a true random sampling. It's self-selecting by people, and that's going to diminish the results. Sampling error is the level of confidence in the findings of a public opinion poll, and basically sampling error comes from the number of people you're asking compared to the number of people whose opinion you're trying to figure out, as well as whether or not you get some skewed results, like, for example, maybe you had an unusually high number of Hispanic respondents to your poll or something like that. A great example of this is actually, as the 2012 election comes up, the great Nate Silver, who does statistical analysis of polls and is one of my heroes, said he did a study the other day showing that polls that took into account cell phones, that called cell phones, favored Barack Obama by a much higher margin than polls that did not. Now, Obama tends to appeal to younger voters, as Democratic candidates usually do, whereas Mitt Romney, the Republican in this case, tends to appeal to older voters. And his argument was, if you don't call cell phones, you are leaving a big chunk of people out of your sample, younger people who may not have a home phone. And so the samples in these polls that were favoring Romney may not be legitimate because they weren't a true sampling of the people. So that's just one example of how sampling works. So why have polls? Well, if you're a politician, a poll can be useful in knowing what the public thinks. I mean, if you're sent there to represent the people, some politicians, and some actually disagree with this theory, but many will say, well, I need to know what the people want before I can serve their interest. Critics say polls make politicians think more about following than leading the public. So if you like polls, you say, I sent that guy there to do what the public wants, and the poll is how we tell him what the public wants. Critics of polls say, well, we sent him there to do what he thinks is right, and if all he does is just look at the latest poll and do that, then that's not good. That's somehow illegitimate. One of the things that happens is the wording of questions may affect survey results. So, for example, you can ask whether people are opposed to abortion or not about 20 different ways. And depending on exactly how you phrase it, you could get numbers as high as 85% of people saying they're against it, or as high as 90% of people saying they support a woman's right to get an abortion. It's all in how you ask the question. We'll look at some of that in class. Another example of this is they found at one point that when you asked people who they were going to vote for, they were more or less likely to vote for people whether they were mentioned first or last. So now when they do presidential polls, they rotate the order they say the names to try to remove any bias simply because it was the first or last name you heard. And so the wording is very important. Polls can distort the election process. One of the things that happens is as it begins to look more and more like somebody's going to win, particularly in the primaries, people will stop supporting the candidate that appears to be losing. And so a lot of candidates complain, I would have done better, but the polling showed that I wasn't doing well, and so people stopped giving me money and people stopped supporting me, and that's why I lost. It's all the polls' fault. Another area that's been criticized is exit polls. This is when the pollsters stand outside of voting places and ask people who you voted for. And they used to do this all the time, and they would through the course of the day you could check, and the news on the TV would be saying, oh, well, it's noon, but according to our exit polling, so-and-so is winning and so-and-so is losing. Again, there were complaints about this, arguing that as people watched the returns, they made up their minds before the election, the voting was even ended for the day, about who was going to win and lose. and so they just chose not to go to the polls. Okay. So what do they tell us about our political information? Well, one thing polls have made it very clear is we don't know very much about politics as a nation. We are really, really poorly informed. We know a lot of times our basic beliefs, but we don't necessarily understand how that relates to the policies of the government. And sometimes there's not much relationship at all. Another thing we've learned from polling is that since 1964, trust in our government has dramatically declined. It did go up a little bit after September 11th, but it is collapsed again. A public opinion poll here. They asked people, how much of the time do you think you can trust the government in Washington to do what is right? And the blue line, the yellow line is just about always. The blue line is most of the time, and the red line is never or only some of the time. And as you can see, back in the early 1960s, you're looking, if you add them together, at almost 3/4 of the population saying the government did the right thing always or most of the time. But the red line, which is never or only some of the time, has dramatically increased. You see the little dip back down towards 9/11, although that actually began before 9/11. But since then, it has skyrocketed back up and is now actually at its lowest levels. But trust in the government is at the lowest levels, probably in American history.